We are so glad you are here this evening with us. I would like to welcome you. We are grateful you have joined us this evening to celebrate the launch of the new book, A Natural Curiosity, the Story of the Bell Museum. My name is Denise Young, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bell Museum. We're thrilled to be offering this program in collaboration with our colleagues here at the University of Minnesota Press. As we reflect on the museum's past and imagine its future, we'd like to begin tonight by recognizing the colonial history of exploration and exploitation that disrespected and dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their knowledge, lifeways, and natural resources. This historical legacy reverberates among us today, especially here in Minnesota and in our museum. At the time of the Bell Museum's founding, Indigenous knowledge and ownership were largely disregarded as legislators sought to direct a new territory that they claimed as their property. I would specifically like to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which the Bell Museum sits and from where I join you this evening. This land was reserved by the Dakota in treaties with the United States in 1805, 1837, and 1851. And though Dakota people were pushed off this land, it remains sacred and central to them today. The Bell serves all communities across this state, and so I'd also like to acknowledge the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, Indigenous keepers of the lands to the north, lands likewise taken despite treaty agreements. Dakota and Ojibwe knowledge systems are essential ways of knowing this place now called Minnesota. At the Bell Museum, we respect that knowledge and the values embedded in it. We value the people and communities that protect Indigenous knowledge systems, and we seek ways to support them in their work. This year marks the Bell's 150th anniversary. We are committed to better understanding our own institutional history and our place in Indigenous dispossession and erasure, and to finding ways to redress the wrongs of both past and present and build respectful, equitable relationships going forward. One small way we hope to do that is through our Indigenous admissions policy. In honor of the Dakota people, we waive admission to our museum galleries to all Indigenous people. And I hope you'll please ask about this policy when you visit the Bell Museum. And so centered on the land where this museum sits, where we conduct our work as learners and educators and researchers, it is my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. George Weiblen, our host and moderator. George is the Bell Museum Science Director and Curator of Plants. He is a distinguished McKnight University professor in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology, and he is also a contributing author to A Natural Curiosity, the Story of the Bell Museum. So George, please take it away.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks so much for your welcome and introduction. I'm so glad to see everyone here tonight. I hope that my video has launched. And, you know, I'll say that I think if you're tuning in tonight, you probably have your own Bell Museum story. You might already know something about us, and you might be as curious as we were to study where we came from. And I can think of my own, dating back to my time as a toddler, losing my parents and being delivered into the museum at the age of 3 by some students who thought this lost child might have wandered out of the museum. Well, I hope that you'll enjoy the threads that we have to trace tonight and the flow of the evening as it unfolds. So we're first going to hear from Barbara Coffin and Dawn Luce, who are 2 of the authors and contributors to A Natural Curiosity. They are incredibly knowledgeable and valued staff of the Bell Museum. After their presentations, we're going to bring the rest of the book team in, including lead writer and co-author Lansing Shepard, co-author Gwen Schagrin, and contributing author Sally Brummel, where a moderated discussion will take place in which you, the audience, have your chance to ask questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. We are also going to bring back something that some of you may recall from the Café Scientifique, which is a little fun interspersed through the evening with Bell trivia questions. These are going to be shared out through Zoom polls, and I encourage you to enter your answers. We're also having, as you might have noticed, live captioning tonight. And if you find it distracting, you can hide it. You just have to click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll also post a link if you wish to see the captions in a separate browser. All right, let's begin with a presentation from co-author Barbara Coffin. Barbara has promoted the conservation and understanding of Minnesota's natural world throughout her career, earning her PhD while a student at the university in connection with the Bell Museum. She's former head of media productions and adult programs at the Bell, played a critical role in designing our new exhibit galleries. She's the executive producer of the Emmy Award-winning documentary, Minnesota, A History of the Land, and a co-editor of the book from the University of Minnesota Press, Minnesota's Endangered Flora and Fauna. So tonight, Barb's going to tell us more about the book's origins and why she and the rest of us set out to pursue the history of the Bell Museum, how we organized the book, and who is the intended audience. So Barb, please take it away.
Great, thanks, George, and thank you all for being here tonight. We understand there's a lot of you on this webinar. So let's see here. Okay, I think we're so excited to share our book with you all tonight. It's a beautiful book. You're looking at the cover right now. In many cases, it's the images that tell the story or bring the story to life. The book was an amazing team effort of many, many people, including the writers, researchers, advisors, but most especially, it's a beautiful book thanks to book designer Carrie Finkler of Carrie Finkler Design. It's the sort of book you'll want to hold, page through, gaze at, but it's also rich in content. So A Natural Curiosity, the story of the Bell Museum, explores the 150-year-old history of the museum. But the book is not a march through time, nor is it a chronological comprehensive history. It's a collection of stories. The reader can pick up the book and read a chapter anywhere in the book. Each story stands on its own. And as we chose what stories to tell, we looked to find the story that best captured that specific moment of the museum's history. So at this time, I'd like to give you an overview of the book contents and its organization. And we'll take a look at some of the book's images. The book is organized into 6 sections. Section 1, what you're looking at here is the section head at the start of that section. A museum is born 1872 to 1940. And the book starts in 1872 with the birth of the museum as part of the state legislative mandated Geological and Natural History Survey. There's 5 stories in this section, including one about the survey, a story about T.S. Roberts, one of the first and long-term directors of the museum, and another about the very earliest dioramas that were constructed in the beginning of the 20th century, the first actually in 1911. Section 2, Growing an Institution, 1920s to 1960s. As you can see, the time period of the sections overlaps. This section also has 5 stories and includes a story on early public education efforts, the heyday of dioramas, as well as a chapter on artist Francis Lee Jaques, the famous mural artist that painted most of the Bell Museum's diorama backgrounds. Many of you may be familiar with his work. Section 3, Wildlife Explorations, 1940s to 1980s, features chapters about research conducted by Bell Museum curators and illuminates what many people may not fully appreciate, and that is that the Bell Museum has both an academic unit and a public program unit. The academic side has curators in ornithology, mammalogy, ichthyology, herpetology, genetic resources, and plants. And these scientists, like George, our host, who is also a curator of plants, teach at the university, conduct scientific research, and curate the museum's scientific collections. Section 4 is titled The Museum in the Environmental Era, and this covers 1960s to 1990s. And again, you'll see that there's overlap between the sections in terms of the timing, but the reader is moving forward through the 150-year history of the museum, nevertheless. In the fourth section, we have chapters on both public programs and scientific research. For example, the museum's education program based on honeybees are discussed in a chapter titled Honeybees on the Roof, Sweetening Science Education. Another chapter on art and science in education programming in a chapter titled Science Through the Lens of Art. And a chapter on curator Frank McKinney and his scientific research titled Nature versus Nurture, the Evolution of Animal Behavior. Section 5, Rediscovering the Collections. This is 1980s up to the present. This section focuses on Bell's scientific collections, including a chapter titled Collections Offer Clues to Environmental Challenges, another one titled Rethinking the Tree of Life. Section 6, and the final section in the book, is a museum for the 21st century, 1990s up to the present. So the last two sections come right up to today. Now, as you've seen in the book, this is the overall sort of way we've divided 6 sections. It's organized by broad themes, moving through history from 1872 to the present. Another important part of the narrative is the main character of each story. In some cases, the main character is a museum scientist or a staff personality. At other times, the main character is a scientific discovery or groundbreaking research with a museum connection. Or other times, a specimen or object in the museum's scientific collection. And finally, the main character at times is actually an educational program or an approach that transformed scientific learning. Here on the screen, you're looking at Anna Pigeon. We have a story and chapter about her connection to the Bell Museum. She's shown in the upper left there as a tour guide, undergraduate tour guide in the 1980s. Later, she became a Bell staff in charge of all the university student guides. And later yet, she decided to go back to school and pursue a PhD, and she's now a professor in avian ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She says that the Bell has had a profound effect on her life journey. Here's an example where of the story, the main character is actually groundbreaking research that has a museum connection. This chapter chronicles the successful reintroduction of the endangered peregrine falcon to the upper Midwest, which was led by museum director and scientist Harrison Bud Tordoff in the 1970s and 80s. In this example, the main character is actually an educational program. And this is showing the Touch and See Room back in the 1960s when it was established for the first time, Touch and See Room Gallery. And in this gallery, the museum developed hands-on inquiry learning. This learning style became a signature feature of the museum and still is. But back in the 1960s, the Bell Museum was among the first in the country to promote hands-on learning. Okay, let's see here. Finally, the main character may be a specimen or object that is part of the museum's scientific collection. And here, in this section, we have a chapter titled 100 Years Later, Minnesota Updates Its Natural History Survey. And in this chapter, the main character is the museum's scientific collections. The DNR's Minnesota Biological Survey uses the museum's collections to understand the documented range of species, rare species in the state. And in return, the survey's collections are donated to the museum to be curated as a part of our scientific collections. So now a bit of history about the history of this book. The book has been in development for a long time. We started the book project back in 2014 when state bonding for the construction of the new building was finally approved on the third try. We realized the museum was at a historic juncture. Moving to a new building meant we would need to pack up and clean out our home, the home that the museum had had for more than 75 years. This was an unrepeatable opportunity to gather important historic information during the process of moving. Huge amount of information would be sent to the university archives. In the end, I think we transferred something like 251 boxes of material to the university archives. Files, photographs, documents were found that had been, quote unquote, lost for the decades. We had a big basement in the old museum. And also, another reason is that the last history that had been written on the museum was published in 1939 by then museum director T.S. Roberts. So it was time for an updated history of the museum. Our initial goal was to have the book published to coincide with the opening of the new Bell Museum in the summer of 2018. Even though we'd secured funding for the book project, we soon realized that our goal was totally unrealistic. We found ourselves fully committed, juggling the many, many tasks of creating and moving to a new museum. So with project funding in hand, researchers on our team did continue to comb through the multitude of materials headed for the archives, but the writing was put on hold. Our revised goal was to complete the book for the museum's 150th anniversary in 2022. And here we are. The book is done and available for purchase. As you can see by now, it's a highly illustrated text written in an accessible style for an interested and general audience. It's 288 pages long. There are 42 chapters with over 350 color and black and white photos. Importantly, we were fortunate to receive funding support that made the project possible. We received 3 grants over a multi-year period that were funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, something you may have heard referred to as the Legacy Fund. And we thank John Fulton of the MHS for his guidance. Putting the Bell's history together was more complicated than we could have imagined. We were 4 authors, 3 contributing authors, 5 reviewers, 9 advisors, representing a wide range of topics of expertise: Indigenous people concerns, history of science, wildlife ecology, botany, art history, astronomy. And then I want to acknowledge the University of Minnesota Press and all the staff there that touched this project, particularly our editor, Kristen Tweeden. So it was an amazing team. We had a great time working on this book together. And as it turned out, it was the perfect project to amuse us during the pandemic. George, you're back on.
Well, thank you, Barb. That was a fantastic overview of the book from beginning to end. And I can't wait to review it again all in detail. I know, folks, you've been waiting now for our first trivia question. And so here it goes. In the early 1900s, Josephine Tilden of the Geological and Natural History Survey in Minnesota was the first female scientist hired by the U of M. What group of organisms did she study? Native orchids, freshwater mussels, songbirds, or marine algae? We'll give you a second to answer using the poll function, and we're going to share all 3 trivia question answers later on in the program. All right. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Don Luce, the former curator of exhibits at the Bell Museum. He is joining us live and direct from inside the Seeing Birds exhibit at the Bell tonight. This exhibit is our first full feature in-house exhibit production in our new facility, and also commemorates our 150th. Don, for more than 4 decades, curated one of the incredible assets of natural history interpretation, the dioramas as they were built in our former location. He curated a lot of traveling exhibits, including the lion's mane, the art of birds. He produced a lot of exhibits that featured in our locations on evolution, wildlife art in America. He started our traveling exhibitions program, developed natural history art collections that we now curate, and he played a critical role in conceiving and designing the Minnesota Journeys exhibit gallery at our new location. And tonight, Don's going to speak about the origins of the Bell and the interplay of the scientific research, the collections, the art, the public education and outreach, and the university students in our evolving effort to better understand and appreciate natural world. So I want to encourage folks to use the Q&A function to share questions you may have for our speakers, and our team's behind the scenes to curate those for a discussion a bit later in the program. Don, please.
Well, thanks everybody. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And I just want to say that, again, this has been a long journey. It's great to have this coming to fruition. And I just want to say that, what I'm going to do tonight, I'm just going to try to give you a little background of the history, hit on some high points, and hopefully fill in a few key ideas that I feel came out of this book. And so I think, one of the things I assume is that the vast majority of you have seen the new museum, this, glittering new edifice here on the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota, opened in 2018. And I think for a lot of people, this might be their first introduction to the Bell Museum. We've had a lot more visitation at our new location than we did on the Minneapolis campus. And so, again, I want to, some people might wonder, where did this museum come from? And so, again, some of you may recall the old museum on the Minneapolis campus on Church Street. This was the home of the museum for 75 years. It opened in 1940, but in reality, the museum really predated this museum by many, many years. And so this new museum that I'm in tonight really had this kind of a deep 150-year history. It was behind it. And one of our objectives for this book is to reveal that deep history. And so I'm going to start back in 1872. I know Barb has mentioned this already, the Minnesota Natural History Survey. And this was something that many states at that time was doing, trying to survey what resources existed in their states. So this is the idea that they were going to send scientists out, naturalists out, collecting plants, animals, rocks, minerals, soils, samples of trees, et cetera, from around the state. And part of this had a practical purpose of trying to promote development, or you might say exploitation, of these natural resources. One difference with the Minnesota Natural History Survey was that it was run by the University of Minnesota. And so this was really a training ground for some of the first scientists in the state of Minnesota. And those collections and information and knowledge that was developed by the survey really became the foundation for our ecological knowledge of the state of Minnesota. This is kind of a record of what the natural habitats in the state were like before they were really radically altered. And to give you a little context here too, during these early years of the survey, the late 1800s, the museum was housed in the university's one single building, Old Main. So it was a one building university, and the museum was simply one room in that one building university. And so over the time, the museum, some of the collections are divided in different areas, and it also was moved from building to building on campus. And here you can see Pillsbury Hall, which was, the museum was housed in Pillsbury Hall, which was a science museum for the university in the beginning. And it's just been remodeled, beautifully remodeled now. And then it moved to the zoology building. And, one of the things that really, one of the people that really made a big impact on the museum in this early period, it was essentially a research institution, collections to house and curate and study the collections from the state. And one of those people who was really trained in that survey was, in those early years, was Thomas Sadler Roberts. And I think Barb mentioned that he worked on the survey as a young student in Minneapolis in the 1870s, 1880s, I think 1870s and 80s. He then went on to a career as a doctor, medical doctor, did that for many, many years in Minneapolis. And then he retired in 1915 to really follow his passion, which is natural history, conservation, and of course, the study of birds. And Roberts really tried to develop the part of the museum, make the museum a public institution where visitors could come. And one of the things that he instituted, was the creation of more ecologically oriented dioramas. And so the beaver diorama here was the first diorama that he directed. He started this project in 1917, finished in 1919. And it was a bit of a groundbreaking departure from earlier types of exhibits, put the animals into their natural habitat, tried to show them as part of an ecological system. And it also was featuring an animal at that time. It's hard to believe today, but beaver had been completely or almost completely extirpated from the state of Minnesota, and actually had been reintroduced from Canada. And so this was also a conservation story. The other thing that Roberts, of course, was really interested in was studying birds. And one of his goals was to publish a major book on the birds of Minnesota. And this he completed in 1932. There's a time period when many states around the country were publishing bird books. And Roberts was very interested not only in compiling all this information, but he also really wanted to spread it to a wider audience. And so he was very insistent on making sure this Birds of Minnesota was illustrated by the leading artists of the day. And it is still considered one of the most beautifully illustrated bird guides of that period. The other thing he really wanted to do, and probably maybe the culmination of Robert's career, was the creation of the museum's own building. And so this is a 1940 Church Street building that, and there's some stories in the book about how this came about, but this new building was the first time the museum had its own place. And this building had not only more room for laboratories and collection spaces, it even had a classroom where Roberts and Breckenridge could show their motion pictures of wildlife to an audience, which was sort of groundbreaking at that time, 1940s. It also had room for more dioramas. And these dioramas, as Barb had mentioned, were painted by Francis Lee Jaques. And these are considered today some of the best, finest dioramas in the world. And so this collection of dioramas are built in the 1940s in the Church Street Museum. Now, I'm not going to go through all the history of this, but what I want to do right now is just give you a few highlights of some of the stories that you would find in the book, because as Barb mentioned, the book isn't a march through time. It's really, we wanted to figure out interesting stories that you could pick up anywhere in the book and read and get this idea, this sort of window into this history. And so one of the, I think the most interesting ones is Josephine Tilden. Now we had a little question about that, Josephine Tilden. I'm going to try not to give away the answer here, but this is an intriguing story. Here is a woman who was determined to become a scientist in the late 1800s, came to the university, became a well-known researcher. And not only that, that wasn't, and again, as the question stated, she was the first scientist hired by the University of Minnesota, but she went on to found her own biological research station on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. So a very intriguing story. Another story is this interplay between, James Ford Bell, this Minneapolis milling magnate, who of course was a proponent of and supporter of the museum, how he intervened to meeting with the director of the American Museum of Natural History in New York to allow the museum there to release Francis Lee Jacques to come and paint the dioramas here at the Bell Museum. Another interesting story was how the museum became the center for developing radio tracking technology. Radio tracking technology is one of these things that very dramatically changed our understanding of wildlife behavior, wildlife use of resources and natural habitats. And here it was developed under the auspices of the Bell Museum in the 1960s, or actually earlier. So that's another interesting story. The other thing, another story would be the story of how this planetarium that had been orphaned and the merger with of that planetarium with the Bell Museum, how that led to breaking through this sort of logjam that the museum had in terms of getting funding for the new building. And so that's another interesting story. One of the probably more intriguing stories that I was very intimately involved with was how to move these dioramas from the museum where everybody thought that they were literally built into the building. No one thought that these could be successfully moved, or at least many people didn't, and how we managed to do this and what that process was. And so so these are just, again, some of these stories that I think you'll find very intriguing. But the other thing I just want to talk about a little bit is how a museum, the Bell Museum, a very small museum, often with moderate funding at best, could make a lot of these innovations. Why were some of the best dioramas found here? Why were radio tracking was produced here? Why was the first discovery room made at the Bell Museum? And I think one of the things that was one of the key factors in that was the fact that the museum was able to bring people from different fields with different expertise and different knowledge and skills and bring them together and have them rub shoulders. So you have, in this case, you have Frank McKinney here, who is really making new discoveries about how nature works, okay? And he's rubbing shoulders with Francis Lee Jacques, who is exploring new ways to depict the workings of nature. So that's an example. Another example would be, here's a museum where we have graduate students who are learning how to be scientists, housed and working together with educators who are exploring new ways to try to communicate that science to the public. So we have a grad student who's studying ducks on one hand, and educators who are exploring this idea of cafe scientifique, about how to engage the public in this scientific research. Another example would be the collections. We have scientific collections that are incredibly important for doing scientific research, for biological conservation. But here's a place that not only uses these collections for science, but also uses these collections to engage the wonder and curiosity of young children, coming together in the same place. And I think all one of the things that has always been real asset for the museum has been the involvement of undergraduate university students who bring this energy and excitement to pretty much everything we've done. I mean, they are the frontline staff of the museum, but they're also working in the museum throughout the rest of the museum. They're working in the collections with researchers. They've worked with me on developing exhibits. They're working on developing education programs as well. And this is really one of the sparks that's helped make the museum what it is today. And so in conclusion, I think one of the things that came out of writing this history is that the synergy of bringing people together who are coming from different areas, but under this common goal of how do we expand the understanding and appreciation of the natural world, and giving those people some freedom to explore and to innovate and to try new things is one of the things that has really been key to making the Bell Museum this natural curiosity that it is today. Thanks.
Don, that was well done. Thank you very much. Packing 150 years of Bell history into 15 minutes is a pretty amazing feat. And we could actually give you a couple more minutes, but I think we're gonna hold that for the Q&A, as I'm sure there are many questions. And speaking of questions, we are about to do trivia question number 2. Are you ready? Here we go. Which Bell Museum director combined a research expedition to the Arctic with his honeymoon? Thomas Sadler Roberts, Walter Breckenridge, Scott Lanyon, or Elmer Burney? We'll give you a few seconds to ponder the answer to that question and whether the lucky bride was fully on board with this proposal. All right, now it's my pleasure to welcome into the Zoom room co-authors Lansing Shepard and Gwen Schagrin and contributing author Sally Brummel. Lansing is a writer specializing in conservation, environmental policy, and natural history. He contributed his very own voice to the public TV series, Minnesota: A History of the Land, which is a perennial favorite of the Friends of the Bell Museum. Gwen Schagrin has worked in exhibit research, design, and production at the Bell since 1992, contributing to our Wildlife in America publication and the preservation and management of the wildlife art collection. Sally Brummel is manager and astronomer-in-chief of the Bell Museum's Whitney and Elizabeth Macmillan Planetarium. She's worked in this field for over 22 years and participated in the union of the Bell with the Minneapolis Planetarium Society that, as Don articulated, brought our Minnesota lens to the cosmos. And so, if we could have Lansing on screen, I have a question for you, Lansing.
Okay.
In the course of writing the book, was there any story or discovery that you found particularly intriguing, puzzling, or mystifying?
Well, that's a tough one, George. There are so many in this book, and but I guess one that seems to have stayed with me is just how powerful a tool gene sequencing has been, and how many amazing things can be done with it. Gene sequencing, of course, is a prime tool of the taxonomists, the Bell's taxonomists, and things that can be accomplished with it are just startling. This is stretching from determining the degrees of relatedness of a vast number of species, species within genres, species within, across families. In many cases, it has upended what we thought we knew about life on Earth, and in other cases, it's confirmed what we've long suspected. For me, the thing that was so intriguing about it is how it has opened the door to past life, and actually given us a peek into even ancient landscapes that are no longer here.
Lansing, do you have a favorite example of what one of those might be,
Yeah,
or something, something unexpected we learned?
Yeah, there's this wonderful story, one among many in the book, about how Andrew Simons, the Bell's curator of fishes, was able to confirm the existence and course of something called the Taze River. It was a major, long vanished pre-glacial waterway. I think the geology has it that it rose in the northwestern Pennsylvania and in the highlands of West Virginia, and ran basically along the course of what is today the Ohio River. It was a major river of the time before the glaciers arrived. And it ran from the east through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois to the Mississippi. And Andrew, by sampling the mitochondrial DNA of a fish species called the northern hog sucker, basically was able to confirm what the geologists had surmised. The hog sucker is this bottom-feeding fish of fast-moving streams and rivers, pretty much all throughout the upper Midwest and the middle Atlantic states. And it's a funny looking thing, has a downward facing mouth with that's kind of shaped like the front end of a vacuum cleaner. And it spends its life on the bottom of these streams, basically sucking up everything aquatic insects, little crustacea.
So what you're saying is that this fish was so busy vacuuming up the floor of this ancient river that it basically ignored what was happening geologically, and the river ceased to exist, and the populations of this fish on one side of the ancient river and the other side were severed, but there's still the DNA
Right.
there. That's just amazing.
Yeah. The story is that I mean, Andrew was there with his team, trying to determine, they were looking at fish species all over this area, and trying to determine how much the fish distributions of the present day could be explained by what had happened in the geological past. And they came across this hog sucker situation where you had hog sucker populations in the old headwaters of this long gone stream, and the populations of the Western range being similar, but populations in the center were distinctly different. And Simon's, was looking at this and saying, what the hell is going on here? But
well, that's a great example of, the kind of scientific discovery that, has been unearthed through researching the book, and one among many. And I know that, as much attention as we could devote to the Hog Sucker, we probably should move on.
Okay.
And give some of the rest of the diversity of life a chance. So thank you for that. I want to capture a question for Gwen now, and maybe we can come back, Lansing, at the end. So Gwen was involved in digging through an incredible amount of material, these 250 boxes of material that went to the archives. So Gwen, what were some of the least expected things you unearthed when you were digging for sources while researching the book?
Sorry. Some of the most important things, interesting things that we found, and some of the most important sources that we used while we researched the book came from cleaning out the old Church Street Museum. As we were preparing for the move, we found a literal ton of materials that were squirreled away in basement rooms and staff offices and in other corners of the museums. We unearthed whole contents of file cabinets, posters, exhibit pieces, planning documents, photos, films, and publications, which we piled on a 25-foot long work surface. And Dan Belden, who was then a student, was absolutely indispensable in organizing which things went to the university archives and which were kept for working on the book. 2 large scrapbooks. Go back in the slides, please. 2 large scrapbooks emerged containing newspaper clippings and museum handouts, primarily from 1938 to 1997. Here you can see an article about T.S. Roberts from 1943 and a scrapbook page showing articles from 1947 to 1948. Dan made a thorough inventory list of the contents of both of these very large scrapbooks. We combed through the extensive digitized records and photographs held at the University of Minnesota archives for early museum history and found the 1892 field notebook of Henry Knocktribe, who was Minnesota's first state zoologist, and he was the museum's second director. And you can see that here. In the archives, we found the annual reports of the Geological and Natural History Survey. The 1880 report shows the first animal specimens that were added to the museum's collections. They include mammals collected by T.S. Roberts in Grand Marais and Duluth in the summer of 1879, when as a young man, he worked for the survey, and you can see him in the lower left of the photograph. Our current curator of mammals, Sharon Jansa, pictured here, was quite interested to see this document of the first animals that were added to the museum. Besides the 2 large scrapbooks that we found at the museum, earlier scrapbooks were already held at university archives. One of them had a document listing the contents of the 1939 cornerstone, which you can see being laid here, of the old Church Street Museum. It would be fascinating to actually see some of the documents that were sealed into the cornerstone. Not all of them have come to light in other sources. We made a comprehensive listing of the museum's newsletter imprint, which had 106 issues published between 1984 and 2015, and heavily relied on this for modern history. We also compiled a 30-page annotated bibliography of print sources, which was a great aid in writing individual stories for the book. And as you know, George, because you yourself were interviewed, we interviewed, I think it was 66 people.
Yeah. Wow. That's, I mean, it's just incredible to think about all you went through, all the material you went through. And it's, it's a real gift that it's documented as it is now, because, I think one of the exciting things about reading this book is how many questions it's going to provoke as we want to dig deeper. We want to know more about this history, so.
Well, it was certainly fascinating for all of us to look at what was already there, because T.S. Roberts especially kept copies of all of his ingoing and outgoing correspondence. It's just massive.
Well, it's great now, thanks to digital technology, to be able to preserve this material in new formats and makes it more accessible. And the
Absolutely.
book is kind of a gateway to that. So, yeah, thanks. Now,
Thank you,
question,
George.
Yeah, you're welcome. And a question for Sally Brummel. What bit of history struck you as you were working on the history of the planetarium?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So I'm so grateful that really I got to learn about its history. A lot of people might think that the planetarium is new to the Bell, but it actually has a 70-year history here in the Twin Cities. And so there was a lot for me to look through, certainly not as many documents as Gwen was talking about. We did move locations a few other times and not everything was saved, but there were some articles we could find, and there are a lot of people still here around that I've been able to talk with and learn about their experiences and their connections to former employees at the planetarium. And what I really love to learn was that the night sky has really always been a priority for what we present in our planetarium. We have a record of the former director that you see there, Maxine Harstick. I've learned from some people around today who knew her. She was quite a character, and I wish I had gotten to know her too. She was one of the first employees when they first opened and were starting to do shows. And she had reported that in their regular schedule was stars over Minneapolis. And so, of course, today we can do so many great things with our digital technology, but really constellations and stars are the #1 request for our visitors. And so we have in our regular schedule, the Minnesota night skies. And I like to think of a question that one of our longtime supporters and contributors and a reviewer of this book, Park Kunkel would ask, how can our children wish upon a star when they've never even seen one? So at the Bell and the Minneapolis Planetarium for 70 years, we're so fortunate we've been able to show so many kids, so many people, these stars, and hopefully inspire them to get out and look at the stars on their own.
Excellent. Thanks, Sally. All right. Keeping an eye on time. And we'll be moving to audience questions in a moment. But before we do that, our last trivia question is, where was the planetarium located before it became part of the Bell Museum? Well, this has given plenty of hints. We have the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, the Public Library, the Science Museum of Minnesota, or the Metrodome Stadium. And as we take a moment to answer, we'll get the answers out as we close the evening. And I know you can't wait to hear the answer to the first 2 questions. But now we are going to bring in some audience questions for discussion. And we have a question wondering, when did the Bell Museum become the Bell Museum? And I think I'm going to direct this question to Don Luce. Don, are you there?
Hi, George. Yes. So this is a little bit more complicated than you might think. And I hope I'm going to get this right, because the museum has actually had a number of different names. It didn't become just the Bell Museum until we moved into the new building. Okay. And so before that, it was the James Ford Bell Museum of Natural History. And certainly when I came to the museum, which of course seems like eons ago, that was the name that was above the door when you came into the museum. And I only later found out that actually the museum, the name when that building, the church building was built, was actually different. And it wasn't changed to the James Ford Bell Museum of Natural History until 1960. So it was added 1960s to honor James Ford Bell, who was a big benefactor of the museum. The 1940s building, in 1940, the name became the Minnesota Museum of Natural History. And so that's what actually was above the door. And before that, it was just the Natural History Museum. And then before that, earlier in the 20th century, it was the Zoology Museum. So, and before that, it was the Minnesota Geological and Natural History Survey. So those are this, I think I've got that pretty well straightened out. I've probably gotten everybody confused, but yes, the museum has had a number of different names over time.
That's great. You took us back in time from our present name, which I know for those of us who were involved in reimagining what our new location would look like, we had to consider that carefully. And I think it's probably not well known that the museum has gone by many names and occupied many buildings over the generations. Now I have a question. For Barb. Barb, so we've heard a little bit about how the book came into being. What were some of the challenges that you faced in writing, in producing this book, and what were some of the challenges that we faced, in trying to tell this story?
Well, excuse me. I think maybe the biggest challenge was weeding out which stories we would include and which ones we wouldn't include. As I said, the book was, oh dear, I think I need, I might have to pass this on to somebody else.
And that's just fine. I mean, if you want to give an entree to some of our challenges, I think, it'd be great to hear from Lansing on this question as well.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. As Barb said, what's going on here? Okay. As Barb said, this idea of what do we leave in? What do we have to leave out? If we had done a standard chronological history, this thing would have been the size of the Oxford English Dictionary and probably about as penetrable, which is why we came up with this idea of doing these Bell-centric history through these Bell-centric lenses. And this is when you think about it, the history here that we're talking about runs from about the closing of the American frontier to the present day, and that takes us. And this is a history of a museum whose primary work has been to help shape and interpret the greater history of which it was a part, and how do you fit all of that in? And this has been one of the most intense collaborative efforts I think that I have ever been involved in. I think it probably couldn't have happened if we four, that is the main writers, Gwen, Barb, Don, and I, hadn't had this long relationship going back, well, since the early 1990s, and we knew ourselves pretty well. We knew, how much we could push, and how much, and when we had to pull back in the discussions and the arguments that we had going forward in trying to sort out these issues, and yet we did it. I don't think this book would have been able to be what it is if we hadn't had that kind of relationship. There are so many ways this project could have gone south, and as I say, it's been an intense many years.
Well, that's I mean, I think one of the benefits of you having known each other and worked together for so long is being able to wrestle through those difficult decisions about what to include and what to let go of. And I think you've got with these 6 parts a really balanced selection of highlights, throughout the history. We've got questions coming in about some of the details of that history, and of course, we're kind of fascinated by Josephine Tilden and this career that she led that was really unprecedented at the time. We have a question about a city park in Berkeley, California. Was Tilden Park named after Josephine Tilden? And I don't know if we can answer that question specifically. If any of you can, please chime in. Or perhaps if anyone on the team is aware of Josephine Tilden's connection to the company in California that used marine algae, perhaps we could speak to that. Anyone care to take that?
Well, one thing that I can say is that her collections ended up for a while in San Francisco. There was I think a canning company or something that the owner of that canning company established a relationship with her and had her collections for a while. So there is a San Francisco, California connection. It never occurred to me, knowing Berkeley, that there could be a connection with Josephine Tilden. It would be something we'd have to look up. It was not, the history of the city of Berkeley was not part of our research.
And I'm not sure that I know that Tilden had a connection to California, but I'm not sure it was San Francisco. I thought it was more Southern California, but I don't know.
I have to share something that came to my attention as once the book was in progress, and thanks to the effort, I knew a little bit more about Josephine Tilden, was able to answer a call from the Wechter family. As the Wechter family that owned this company, they used marine algae in the production of soaps and skincare products and so forth. And of course, that's still done today. But this company had supported some of Josephine Tilden's expeditions and acquired her collections. And yeah, they had a connection there in San Francisco. But Tilden Park in Berkeley. I've
been to the park, but I haven't.
Me too.
That's a question we can't answer tonight.
I think it's named for somebody else, but I'll find out and let you know.
Well, we do know that there is a natural area named Botany Beach, I believe. There's some signage up on Vancouver Island that speaks to the University of Minnesota Seaside Station, although no remains of the station itself exist.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of that. It's a beautiful area. And if we had had more room in the book, it would have been nice to have put a picture of the current Botany Beach in, because it's gorgeous. George, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so a question for Sally Brummel. How has planetarium technology changed over time from what you showed to where we are now?
Oh, that could take me a while to talk about, but I'll try and keep it brief. So planetariums originally were, some sort of enclosure with holes drilled into it and a light inside of it, and those holes were in the shape of the constellations, and it projected up into the dome. So really very simple, but in a dark room with those pinpoint lights, it could just be beautiful. And those great big machines, some people might remember if they went to the Minneapolis Planetarium in the library, something that looked like a giant insect. They got more and more intricate. They had what they called cages put on them, where they had gears and rotations to represent each of the planets, so they could go across the sky at their actual rate compared to each other. Mars would move more quickly than Jupiter and Saturn, so you could just turn a dial and they would move, in their appropriate rate. And then slide projectors, how many people know those terms? Slide projectors, slide carousels could cover the dome, and it would, before there was video, you could still do full dome coverage of great images. And then video came in to be projected on a small scale as projectors got better and better. And then a couple decades ago, finally, the projectors that were able to cover the whole dome, whether it's one projector or multiple projectors with a special fisheye lens, a curved lens to match the curved screen of the dome. So really, and the technology keeps improving, but always with that goal of really being able to show a great, nice, beautiful night sky, but also add in all kinds of 3D modeling and real-time exploring the universe. It's really so many great things you can do in the planetarium.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Sally. I'm just trying to imagine where we're going in the future with visualization. And I think we're at the cutting edge right now. It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
I can give you a little bit of a preview, though.
Oh, okay.
We don't
Please
have
do.
it, but the next step is LED domes. So instead of projecting onto it, the dome itself is made of LEDs. I haven't seen it. There are prototypes out there. So that's what's coming next. Might be a while, but yeah.
Just kind of like your computer screen is a bunch of pixels. You would, wow. Okay. Yeah, given how projectors break down, this sounds like a good, it could be a good move. Yeah. Hey, we have something special. A special guest in the audience reports that Thomas Sadler Roberts was my great-grandfather. So I look forward to learning more about his role in the history of the museum. So Don, could you say a little bit more than about T.S. Roberts? You spoke of him earlier, but there's a lot there.
Yeah,
more.
and first of all, I want to say that there's a great source for information for T.S. Roberts. Again, a former graduate student, Susan Leaf, wrote this fabulous book, a biography of T.S. Roberts called A Love Affair with Birds. And she really dug deep into this and went through, the University Archives have this phenomenal record of all his papers and correspondence. And he was corresponding with lots of people, lived a long time. And so she really created this very readable, very wonderful book. that went through his life, and it's a really phenomenal life. And I mean, one of the things that you don't think about, here's somebody who's achieved all this, and he actually he as a young man suffered from tuberculosis. In fact, one of the reasons he came to Minnesota was his father had tuberculosis, and there was no treatment for it except to get out in the fresh air. That was what people thought. And so go to Minnesota for that, really fresh air. And one of the reasons he signed up for these survey crews, again, was to get out in the fresh air to try to, overcome this tuberculosis. So it's just one example. But the fact that as a teenager, as a high school student in Minneapolis, he started this basically a naturalist society in Minneapolis to start studying the record. And some of the earliest records we have of nature in Minnesota in our collections are birds and other, I'm not sure he did plants, but certainly birds collected by T.S. Roberts dating back to the 1870s.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Quick question for Barb. How long did the writing of the book take? When we got to that,
okay, here we are. I know we started with when we got the bonding, then we said, we should really do a history. The last one was done in 1939. And actually it was Gwen who sat down and put together a list of 100 things or more or less, somewhere around 100 points that we would need to cover in a history. And I think that got us thinking, okay, we should do this, and this is the time. So from 2014 to now, of course, the writing got halted for a while we all redirected our efforts towards planning the new museum. But overall, what is that? That's 8 years.
Yeah, I might jump in right now and say, when Gwen and Barb came to me with this idea of writing a history of the museum, I thought they were crazy. And I said, no way. I mean, we have to fund a new museum. We got to plan a new museum, build it. We've got to, plan this new exhibit galleries and move those dioramas. But they finally convinced me to do this. And I agreed that I would do it as long as Barb managed the project, which she's done a great job for these 8 years. So
I'd like to jump in here too.
Please.
Barb came to me in 2016 to quote, write the book. And the thought was that I would come in, I would be fed research by Barb and Don and Gwen, and I would interview scientific staff and support staff, and put it all together. It'd probably take about a year, and then another year to produce it. And I would say that probably we started this thing in fall of 2016, or at least after Barb had hired me. And it probably took us a week to understand that this little tail that we had started to pull had really belonged to an elephant. And it quickly became apparent that there was no way one person was going to be able to write this in the amount of time that we had, at least to the degree that we wanted this to be. So that's when we decided to divvy up the work. And it was decided that I would write the bulk of the book, but that other people would take on those areas, write the first drafts of those areas that they knew best. And I mean, Don has lived through and been part of the history of the bell, the last, I would say, 1/3 of the bell's existence. And I mean, the guy's old, and he would be obviously
not as old as you.
He's obviously the guy who was best positioned to write that, and in fact wound up writing the bulk of the balance of the book. Barb came in with three or four drafts of other things that you knew better than most anybody else. And then Sally, of course, came in with a dynamite history of the planetarium. And then George and Tim Whitfield came in with some parts of the planetarium's history and the digitizing of the collections that only George could write, and all of this stuff, all of these things would come back to me. Well, before they did that, they would be critiqued by the four of us, Gwen, Don, and Barb and I. The copy was the science was sent back to the curators for to make sure that we got the science right, and then everything would come back to me and be given the Gwen Schagrin treatment. She besides being a cracker Jack grammarian, she also has a way of reducing bloated leads and turning copy that is kind of awkward into something smooth. After all of that, I would be responsible for going through it all and working on those pieces that needed working to make sure that all of this read as if it came from one voice. And I think I've said it couldn't have happened without a copacetic team, and it was intense.
Thanks, Lansing. Yeah, just one correction. Tim Whitfield and I contributed to the herbarium stories. The herbarium being a latecomer to the Bell Museum's collections.
True.
The botany department managed the collections of plants in a location apart from the zoological collections. That's actually still the case, as we have collections distributed in academic departments and not necessarily all housed in the building. But I also see that Gwen had unmuted her voice. Perhaps, Gwen, did you want to add something to this? I thought was going to be a quick question about how long it took to write the book.
Well, I guess I would just say that in the course of this, we had many discussions about what to be included and what not to be. And there are a couple of features in the book that help, since we decided that we really didn't want to write a chronological history. There is a timeline at the beginning of the book that will help readers place these stories in history. And it also reflects a few world events and science events. One other thing that we did is we wanted to document all the old dioramas. And there is an appendix in the book in the back that shows pictures of all the old dioramas, the creators, and where they are right now. So some cool other features, plus an exhibits list, a publications list, a lot of features for the book.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that these stories, which, you know, in many cases are really influenced by just sort of the passion that, you know, the individuals and contributors, those who were interviewed, those who left materials behind in the basement of the old museum, you know, to tell those stories. But it's bookended by the materials that you put together, Gwen, in terms of the timeline, sources, the documentation of when dioramas were made, and what they contain and so forth. And that leads me to a question. We've actually had a number of questions from the audience come in. The audience is especially interested in the diorama move, and that is a part of the book, absolutely. But I think it's fair to say we could write a book just about the diorama move. And so I've got to throw this to you, Don. Like what, how long did the diorama move take? And what were some of the biggest concerns we faced about the diorama move, the biggest challenges we faced?
Okay. Well, first of all, this, of course, is taking place amongst everything else. So we were writing this history book, we were planning a new museum, and we had basically 18 months from the time we closed the old museum to when we had to open the new museum. So that's really the time frame that we had to work within. And but I had been working on this issue for probably 20 years before that. Okay, trying to figure out how to move these, because as I mentioned in my talk, the backgrounds are heavy plaster concrete walls on a wire mesh that are locked physically into the structural parameters of the old museum. And the foregrounds are built, most of them are actual, the birds and mammals are actual specimens, taxidermy. The plants are all recreations in wax made from molds of real plants. Some are actually the branches and trunks of real trees. But
had anybody ever moved this form of natural history art of any distance from one building to another?
There were a few cases of museums moving dioramas within the structure, within the building. And there were a few cases of them moving from one building to another, but none of them really exactly like what we were trying to do. But happily, I found some really talented people along the way who could help with this. And they were really dedicated to it. And they were, put their heart and soul into it. And, I always tell this joke about this when I talk about it, that there are many people who love the old dioramas, the old Bell Museum. And there were actually some of these, my former colleagues at other museums, who were actually really quite upset that we were moving them because they thought the museum was this, we had to preserve it. And many of them said, well, even if you move them, they're just never really going to be the same as what they were. And I always tell sort of a joke, and they actually were right. They're not the same. And I think for the most part, they're better than they were in the old Bell Museum, because we were able to do things, or not, I would say that, we got these talented people who could do it, and they were able to make improvements on these dioramas. So we really tried to stay very consistent to the intent of the artist at the time, and create what's behind the glass, pretty much what they would have intended to do if they could have done it, and preserve it as much as possible. So the other thing I want to mention is that we made a documentary about this process. And so that is a feature. It's called Windows to Nature. And again, one of these things that Barb Coffin managed, and it was a nice feature, and it's available, I think, on the TPT website, and I think you can get it through a link from the Bell Museum website as well.
Yeah, thanks, Don. We are on the cusp of wrapping the evening, and we'd love to keep talking about this, but I think it is time for us to turn to to thank first the panelists and audience for contributing to this lively discussion. And I think now we can turn to those trivia questions and see what we've got here. Our first question about Josephine Tilden. What did she study? It was marine algae. And of course, looking at our responses, we are split about equally between the orchids, the mussels, the songbirds, and marine algae. And so great job, everybody. Just goes to show that we all have much to learn about the history of the museum. Now let's turn to what museum director used their honeymoon to enhance the specimen collections of the Bell Museum. Well, okay, we may have some knowledgeable folks in the audience, or just some good guessers based on what we've heard so far tonight. 60% of our audience guessed correctly that Walter Breckenridge combined his research expedition with the honeymoon. And the others, the other answers about equally, the other candidates were about equally split. All right. Where was the planetarium located before it became part of the Bell Museum? And there it is, our dear old Minneapolis Public Library. And you can see the dome sitting atop the Minneapolis Public Library. This facility that I believe emerged in the early 60s in Minneapolis. And, you know, for those of us who recall that old location, when the architects of the new Bell Museum showed us a design that did not feature a dome on top of the Bell Museum, many of us were very confused. How can you have a planetarium that doesn't signal the presence of a dome? But in fact, the architects had some really brilliant ways of bringing together Earth, sky, and the universe into the design. So we 80% of us guessed the correct location of the planetarium. You can learn more about the cast of characters and the specimens and the stories in A Natural Curiosity, the story of the Bell Museum. So I believe we have a picture here of the cover featuring a beautiful painting by Francis Lee Jaques, which is, of course, one of our dioramas, featured dioramas, the Sandhill Cranes. A Natural Curiosity, the story of the Bell Museum, is available during public hours to pick up a copy in person at the Curiosity Shop or order directly online through the University of Minnesota Press. We're grateful for all the support we received from the press in producing this book. I believe Sally has posted a link in the chat where you can purchase online. We're really grateful for the partnership with the press, for collaborating with us on tonight's event, the support we received from the Legacy Grant to the Bell team, the appropriation to the Historical Society from Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And lastly, tonight's program is part of our 150th anniversary celebration. Thank you to all our sponsors for supporting this celebration, especially tonight's presenting sponsor, General Mills. This is a truly exciting year for the museum. Please join us at the museum for seeing birds and the other programming and exhibits we're featuring throughout the year. Thanks to the authors and to you, our audience. Take care, be safe, and have a good night.